Okay. Yeah, that was a wonderful paper. We'll discuss it at the end. Thank you so much for coming here. So my paper is going to be a little, not little, it's going to be very different because I'm separating masculinity from male bodies, and I'm talking about tomboys. So the title, as you see, is Hey, She's a Bro, Tomboys and Desire in India. Our understanding of adult gender has been troubled by queer theory, but adolescent gender troubling is yet to be fully understood. To think about this, I would like to examine tomboy as a category that not only troubles our ideas of girlhood, but also exists within the grey area between girl, trans boy, and boy. While Judith Halberstam, in her seminal study of female masculinity, notes the futility of the tomboy narrative and concentrates on, I quote, queer female masculinity almost to the exclusion of heterosexual female masculinity, since the latter represents an acceptable degree of female masculinity as compared to the excessive masculinity of the dyke, end quote, I argue that the category of the tomboy, and especially that of the heterosexual tomboy, is productive, since it troubles our ideas of girlhood, desire, gender relations, and heteronormativity. Borrowing from literary scholar Catherine Bond Stockton, I understand tomboys as an act of growing sideways, which delays proper femininity, which might or might not arrive. Given that the project is in its nascent form, I'm only beginning to think of it conceptually. The endeavor here is to put forward a few tentative questions and articulate some of the complexities related to the project. I start with a personal story. On 15th June 2014, on Father's Day, I posted on Facebook a photograph of myself as a 12-year-old, along with my father, teaching me photography. I titled the photo in the following manner: Bringing Up a Tomboy in the 1990s, and followed it up with a rather long quote on tomboyism from Judith Halberstam from her book Female Masculinity. The post on Facebook got a number of responses. One of them was from a woman who was a friend's friend and hence a stranger to me, who wrote, quote, I totally agree, this was what happened to me, end quote. This comment intrigued me the most, and I opened her Facebook page to find the photograph of a smiling middle-class woman with short cropped hair, dressed in a plain cotton sari, and who appeared to be in her 40s. From her public profile, I gathered she was an ex-IAS officer in Karnataka, but nothing really pointed to her marital status or her sexuality. It wasn't clear to me what the this in this happened to me stood for. Did it stand for her experience of being a tomboy? What was this woman's story? Was she married? What were her desires like? What made her remember her adolescent self, since I'm talking about adolescence here, with such conviction and nostalgia today as an adult? What was the transition from the tomboyism of her adolescence to the person she is today as an adult? The primacy of memory, both in my post as well as the woman's comment, made me reflect on the relationship between tomboyism during adolescence and adulthood. What was the transition from an adolescent tomboy to an adult like? What did it say about queer adolescence and adulthood? Do queer adolescents, and in this case tomboys, necessarily become queer adults? This autoethnographic exploration leads me to uncover other such narratives of adult women. In specifically examining the narratives of adult women who identified as tomboys in their adolescence, I don't seek to necessarily understand it as a heteropatriarchal pressure on tomboys to become more feminine as they reach adulthood, but rather as a way to disrupt the linear progression from queer childhood to queer adulthood. As Jen Gilbert maintains, that we must be open to the, quote, possibility that childhoods do not predict adulthoods, and that queer sexuality, if untethered from the verticality of development, may not settle down into legible LGBTQ identities, end quote. It is this statement which informs most of my understanding of tomboyism in this paper. To this effect, I seek to ask larger questions of the category of heterosexual tomboys, because I feel that is specifically questioning heteronormativity rather than lesbian tomboys. So I'm asking larger questions of the category of heterosexual tomboys, specifically in the middle-class urban Indian context. So I ask, what does being a tomboy do to desire and gender relations in the family and in school? What are the messages of masculinity and feminities that tomboys receive from the family? Is tomboy an aspirational category, an aspiration to have access to the freedom enjoyed by boys? What is the experience of the transition from tomboy adolescence to adult womanhood? In this paper, I seek to explore some of the complexities in these experiences, and probably I don't explore all the questions. But the experiences of being a tomboy, I also draw from Bombay cinema, from autoethnography, and from preliminary interviews with urban middle-class adult women in their early 30s, reflecting on their adolescent lives and their transition to adulthood. So the sample is very small, and because I don't aim for the paper to be comprehensive, but to open up a debate on tomboy. And the paper is divided into two sections. The first one examines the complexities of identifying as a tomboy, and the second section unpacks the question of desire for tomboys. Identifying as tomboy. In this section, I briefly look at the nuances of identifying as a tomboy. One respondent, Tara, so I've changed the names to protect the identities, spoke about how tomboy was not a category which she identified with herself. She only remembers those around her calling her a tomboy. Growing up in the 1990s, she mentions how her cousins and friends were reading Enid Blyton's Famous Five and often said to her, "You are like George." Some of her friends celebrated her tomboyism, others weren't too happy about it, while others asked why she wanted to be that way. She also recounts incidents when other people would mistake her for a boy. She remembers an occasion when someone asked her little sister, "What is your brother's name?" She also goes on to recount how bus conductors mistook her for a boy, and that did annoy her, but not too much. Tara describes herself as an 11-year-old who wore kajal, eyeliner, shorts, boots, and had very short hair, and who would go out with a large ferocious dog on a chain. So this is her narrative of herself as an adolescent. Tara describes this scene as tomboy or butch. One can see how her embodied experience of being a tomboy involves makeup also, and upsets the neat understanding of tomboys as not interested in any form of makeup or jewelry. Tara also mentions that she was a tomboy between the ages of 11 and 14 and describes this as a phase. Her narrative blurs the strict lines between adolescence and adulthood when it comes to tomboyism. She recounts how she went from performing a tomboy identity to a more feminine one, and then going back to performing a tomboy identity again in her early 20s. She characterizes these as phases of experimentation, which were intimately tied to her migration for work and education. The spaces she occupied during her growing up years deeply influenced the way she experienced these phases. I read these phases of experimentation as an act of growing sideways, which is non-linear, non-vertical, which lingers and delays any strict idea of queer childhood and heteronormative future, or queer childhood and queer future. Another respondent, Meera, describes her experience of being a tomboy as a pleasurable one. I quote, "I remember having boy-cut hair, that's short hair, partly during my childhood but mostly during my adolescent years. I was underweight, thin and tall, and often wore pants, shorts or even skirts. But my greatest joy and pleasure lay in being identified as a boy. When I was 13, I visited Mumbai for the first time. As I stood in a queue at SL World, a couple of girls behind me exclaimed 'boy' upon seeing me. I still remember the thrill and pleasure I felt back then. I love to perform a boyish masculinity. It was fun and desirable to be one of the boys. It was fun to be like the boys, to be tough, and to be never seen crying in public. But I never had enough physical strength. The feminine girls were often physically stronger than me, and I felt like the lack of physical strength was a failure to perform a certain masculinity." End quote. Meera's tomboyism is not restricted to clothes, since she wears skirts, but her tomboyism includes the performances of normative boys, not crying, being tough, playing with the boys. For Meera, tomboyism is experienced both as a source of pleasure and a sense of failure to perform a certain kind of hegemonic masculinity. This narrative opens to us ways in which adolescent tomboys can or cannot perform masculinity. This complicates the idea that tomboyism is necessarily about agential transgressions or breaking of gender binaries. Meera's embodied experiences of being a tomboy points to the sense of failure in not being able to conform to either emphasized femininity or hegemonic masculinity. In both Meera and Tara's narratives, we see how the performance of tomboyism might or might not be linked to wearing shorts or boys' clothes. These narratives also point to the heterogeneity in tomboy experiences and the role that peers and family can play in identity formation. Both Meera and Tara, while not embodying a girly girl existence as adult women, don't also identify as trans men or transgendered beings. They clearly state that they identify as adult women. Judith Halberstam discusses the category of the good tomboy, that is, those with a queer childhood and a heterosexual future, and the bad tomboy, those with a queer childhood and queer future. One sees that Meera and Tara's experiences of being a tomboy disrupts this duality, this dualistic understanding of good tomboy or bad tomboy, since their adulthood does not seem either legibly queer nor clearly heteronormative. To move to my second section on desire, examining the question of desire in tomboys also further problematizes the dual categories of good tomboy and bad tomboy. Both Tara and Meera speak of the costs of being a tomboy and desiring a boy. So I'm talking about heterosexual tomboys. Meera describes how her image and personality did not make her attractive enough to boys. This made her unhappy. And while she did try to girly herself up a bit, she didn't succeed at it, since it did come from what she says inside. She felt sad that she didn't have a boyfriend or couldn't be like others. While growing up, Tara constantly asked herself, quote, "Why does everyone want to be my friend but not my potential romantic partner? Should I feminize myself more, be like other girls who don't talk, who don't fight?" I had arbitrary crushes, imaginary crushes on the boy next door, on film stars, on cricketers. I had imaginary partners. End quote. Tara goes on to say that by the time she first started dating a boy at the end of the 10th standard, she had already feminized herself a great deal. Tara also discusses how she desired both boys and girls when she was growing up, but didn't speak about any same-sex relationships and the complexities of such relationships while growing up. One could read Tara's efforts to feminize herself as a form of heteropatriarchal pressure. This effort seems to fit into the category of the good tomboy, who eventually grows up to be a pretty feminine heteronormative woman, forgetting her tomboy past, as in the cinematic narratives of Kuch Kuch Hota Hai or Main Hoon Na. But Tara's failure to entirely feminize herself points out how the good tomboy is also flawed, and that there might be tomboys who, despite themselves, fail to be a good tomboy. Meera poignantly talks of the impossibility of desire as a heterosexual tomboy. Quote, "I loved boys right from the age of 8 or 9 years old. In my mind, I liked to be called a boy, be like them, and love them too, all the while inhabiting a girl's body. But maybe the boys I knew were all conforming to strict gender roles. They seemed to only love girls who performed the role of a girl. And suddenly, the tomboy seemed undesirable. Maybe I didn't try hard enough. But my adolescent self never experienced any gaze of attraction or desire from boys. Why would a boy like another boy in a heteronormative world? This challenge and question structured most of my interactions with boys and men for most of my growing up and adult life. This was encapsulated by a comment a male friend made to me a few years back. "You were a tomboy, how can you have a boyfriend?" End quote. Meera's narrative also problematizes the strict lines between adolescence, adulthood, good tomboy and bad tomboy. The two popular films, Kuch Kuch Hota Hai and Main Hoon Na, represent the pain that Tara and Meera experience and the impossibility of being desired by boys or men. Social media is also invested in understanding tomboys and speaking of this impossibility of desire. Scoop Whoop lists it's a social media site, lists the 20 signs that once you were a tomboy, and the 19th sign of being a tomboy was, quote, "But life isn't easy for a tomboy. We have lost many of our crushes to overly womanly women or have been friend-zoned by them because, hey, she's a bro." I mean, that's where I borrowed my title from. It is interesting that the term friend-zoned, which is mostly used for men, is used here for tomboys too. Apart from being impossible, this desire also seems unspeakable. As the tomboy Kajal in the film Kuch Kuch Hota Hai sings as an adult woman, "Tujhe yaad na meri aaye, kisi se ab kya kehna," which translates as, "You don't remember me, what is the point of speaking about it to anyone?" This pain is also not restricted to adolescence but spills over into adulthood, as seen in Meera's narrative as well as in the films. But both films imagine that the resolution to this impossibility of desire is to become a heteronormative feminine woman, as a resolution which both Tara and Meera resist and often fail to perform. The trope of the good tomboy becomes hegemonic and often difficult to embody. While I did start my paper stating how tomboyism troubles adolescence, the ethnographic data points to how difficult it is to tie tomboyism to adolescence alone, troubling the strict developmental lines between adolescence and adulthood. Judith Halberstam, in her discussion of tomboyism, states that, quote, "Tomboyism is punished when it threatens to extend beyond childhood into adolescence, and that it is in the context of female adolescence that the tomboy instincts of millions of girls are remodeled into compliant forms of femininity," end quote. Unlike Halberstam, in this paper, I have tried to show how tomboyism does extend into adulthood without really obvious threats, and that the tomboy instinct need not always be remodeled into compliant forms of femininity. The ethnographic data shows how the experience of tomboys are far more complex than simple formulas of external punishment or compliance. Failure also emerges as a key trope, as a common trope through the paper. The failure of performing emphasized femininity or hegemonic masculinity, the failure of being a good tomboy, and the failure of desire. It might be more useful to follow these failures, reading them as acts of growing sideways, to understand the experiences of tomboyism. Thank you.
Hello. So the final speaker in today's event is Yadukrishnan PT. Yadukrishnan is a PhD scholar at the Manipal Centre for Humanities in Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He is the author of The Noblest Fallen, Making and Unmaking of Bhagat Singh's Political Thought, which was published by Manipal University Press in 2019. His current research focuses on the construction and articulation of dominant caste identities in Malayalam cinema in the closing decades of the 20th century.
This is part of a paper I'm working on, and an even smaller part of a chapter I'm working on. So the larger themes I'm discussing here are still to be fully developed. The paper is called Nair Masculinity in Padmarajan's Thuvanathambil. Perhaps there is no other filmmaker more celebrated in the history of Malayalam cinema than writer-director P. Padmarajan. Between the years 1979 and 1991, Padmarajan wrote 36 screenplays, out of which he directed 18. He has also written 14 novels and several short stories. Kerala literati often describes the event of Padmarajan's death in 1991 as an end of an era, marking the demise of a progressive movement in Malayalam cinema, paving way to more commercial, formulaic, market-driven movies. This purportedly progressive film movement that Padmarajan, among others, represented in the 1980s was middle cinema or middle-brow cinema, which had appropriated the realist aesthetics of the parallel art house productions of the 1970s, new wave in Malayalam cinema, so as to target the newly formed middle-class spectators of Kerala. This paper explores how Padmarajan's Thuvanathumbikal, translated as Dragonflies in the Spraying Rain, one of his most acclaimed films, takes advantage of its middle-brow nature to address an unresolved historical conflict between two starkly distinct and contradicting identities. That is that of the agrarian masculinity of the traditional landlord, the Tamburan figure, and its modern antithesis, that is the educated urban youth, both of which are curiously embodied in the protagonist Yadukrishnan, in the form of a certain duality in his personality. The plot of Thuvanathumbikal revolves around the life of Yadukrishnan Menon, played by Mohanlal, who is living a dual life. One in his Nair Tharavad, traditional matrilineal joint family household, in the village, with his mother and sister, where he conducts himself as an old-fashioned boorish landlord, and another one in Thrissur city, 14 kilometers outside his village, where he is known among his friends as a mischief-making, beer-drinking, eccentric youth who seemingly embraces modernity and all its supposed vices. It is important to note that Yadukrishnan in the story is the son of a late Chief Justice, who is repeatedly referred to as Justice Tamburan throughout the film. This term by itself is a very curious one, for the word Tamburan refers to an upper caste landlord who was once depended upon by tenants and neighboring villagers for sustenance and trade. Therefore, adding the title of Justice to this designation assigns an extra layer of legal legitimacy to his already landowning authority. Needless to say, Yadukrishnan has inherited a substantial fortune from his father. The film is about Yadukrishnan falling in love with two women, Radha, played by Parvati, a college student and a distant family relative of Yadukrishnan, and Clara, played by Sumarata, a young sex worker who is new to the profession. Here Yadukrishnan struggles to choose between Radha and Clara, where eventually Clara decides to marry one of her clients and part ways with Yadukrishnan, whereby Radha and Yadukrishnan are united. Cultural historian Dilip Menon traces a particular practice in Malayalam cinema from its early years, where the conditions of the Nair community, the dominant Shudra caste in Kerala, is posed as a metaphor for the conditions of Kerala in its entirety. This Nair universalism, as he terms it, has historically sidelined and marginalized the histories and narratives of the various religious and caste minorities in Kerala. Menon traces the initial instances of such a practice in M.T. Vasudevan Nair's novels and screenplays written in the 1960s. Menon writes about the strategic absence of the ocean in Vasudevan Nair's writings, signifying a conceptualization of the region by the landed upper caste elite in stark opposition to the non-upper caste and non-Hindu section of the population, who depended on the ocean for sustenance and trade. As an extension to this, there was also a significant level of animosity generated in these stories towards a nouveau riche coming back to Kerala after working in Gulf countries. The construction of the regional landscape in literature and cinema was thereby limited to narratives about the landed class in Kerala, largely commenting on the decline of matrilineal. According to Menon, one of the themes that was persistent in many of these narratives was that of the tussle between the older order of agrarian masculinity, represented by the Karnavan, mother's brother and head of the family in matrilineal system, and the newer order of the educated young man. For this, Menon cites a couple of novels and screenplays of Vasudevan Nair written in the late 1950s and 1960s like Murappennu and Irritante Atmavu. It is precisely these two conflicting identities of the traditional matrilineal landlord and of that of the modern educated youth process within the character of Yadukrishnan that this paper is interested in. But before this, the specificities of Malayalam middle-brow cinema of the 80s has to be looked into. Middle-brow cinema and its placement within the film industry has been a point of interest for scholars over the years. Bindu Menon argues that middle cinema was ubiquitously staged as a genre of quality in between films, which defied some of the cinematic conventions of both Malayalam commercial and art cinemas and self-consciously indulged in new film practices. In other words, it was supposed to be the perfect balance between what was then considered commercial and parallel. This is crucial, for then there were three different categories of cinema coexisting: popular, middlebrow, and parallel, with several prominent literary figures spearheading these movements. It is to be noted that at the time these categories were neither as rigid nor as homogeneous as it is described now. Not only were these categories porous in nature, many of the writers and directors who had popularized these individual movements had also worked in the production and progression of other film categories. However, the demand for middle cinema was already in decline towards the late 1980s, even before Padmarajan's death, because of various economic, social and cultural factors. Radish Radhakrishnan, in his essay, What is Left in Malayalam Cinema, discusses some of the factors that led to the decline in popularity of middle-brow cinema. One of the reasons he cites is that of the rise in popularity of Tamil commercial films and superstar figures like Rajinikanth. Malayalam cinema at that time was concerned about losing its audience to Tamil cinema. Something has to be said about the newly formed middle-class spectators of the 1970s and 80s, for their ingress into the socio-political realm had actively informed the narrative and formal experiments that middle cinema had undertaken. K.P. Jayagumar and Rajesh Amar argues that middle cinema had at many times become a vessel for the insecurities of the new middle class who were primarily upper caste, many of them newly employed in government clerical posts in the city at the time. This tension surrounding the middle class status was also caused by the after effects of a series of land reforms throughout the 60s, which provided rights for the tenant on land ownership. The entry of other factors were the entry of non-upper caste workers into the government sector and the increase in wealth of non-Hindu, non-upper caste subjects because of the Gulf boom. Elements of this anxiety can be found in Thuvana Thumbigal, most visibly in the way the opening segment of the film establishes Jayakrishnan's Nayar Tharavad, where its grandiose is starkly contrasted by the shack of a nuisance-causing former tenant living adjacent to it. Following the first heated encounter Jayakrishan has with the drunk tenant Ramanuni, played by Jagadish Srikumar in the film, Jayakrishan's mother laments about how things have changed for the landed elites. This is a conversation between Jayakrishan's mother and a coconut trader called Varghese. I cannot believe that he, the tenant, has the gall to speak like that. When Tamburan was alive, I had often wondered whether he was mute. Now look at him show off, mother says. After Tamburan's death, everyone grew a tongue and hand. He can now speak however he cares to. He's a tenant, everyone is on his side. Landlords have no one to speak for. Jayakrishan's mother is here talking about the 1969 Land Reform Act, which abolished the tenancy system along with providing former tenants a set patch of land which previously was under the landlord. And not to mention the legal protection from arbitrary evictions, something that was deemed revolutionary for landless labourers in Kerala and evidently not a cause for celebration for the landed elite. Jayakrishan complains throughout the film about the nuisance created by the former tenant, eventually bullying and blackmailing him off the land. As mentioned before, Jayakrishan is portrayed living a dual life in the story, taking up two personas in two different spaces. The agrarian landlord persona he adopts in his Tharavad and the village is in many ways defined by the antagonistic relationship with the tenant. K.P. Jayagumar in Jati Vyavasthe Malayalam Cinema, caste system in Malayalam cinema, writes that Malayalam cinema has had a long history of ridiculing poverty and that the comic rendering of tenant Ramanuni's predicament neatly falls into this tradition. There is an entire subplot in the film involving Jayakrishan's encounters with Ramanuni. As mentioned before, it is established in the very beginning of the film that Ramanuni is living off the land that is temporarily assigned to him by Jayakrishan's father, Justice Samburan, before his death. And that after the passing of the 1969 Land Reform Act, Ramanuni received legal ownership of the land. Jayakrishan, however, is not in favour of the situation, for he claims that this land was reserved for Jayakrishan's widow sister by their father and that he is willing to buy a new patch of land away from their house for relocating the tenant. But the tenant is refusing to do so. The argument is very much that the previously landless tenant is quite comically misusing the already unfavourable for the landlord Land Reform Act, antagonizing his previous landlord in a form of perverse revenge at the expense of one's own family, who would also be supposedly better off with relocation. This is where middle cinema often leans more towards its commercial counterparts, for the parallel art house productions, admittedly often having its own casteist underpinnings, would not dismiss poverty through comedy. Middlebrow cinema in this sense was indeed very selective about the themes it wanted to seriously engage with. Nevertheless, this comic portrayal of the tenant-landlord relationship is important for the narrative, for there were the only few instances where the film could portray the boorish landlord act that Jayakrishan puts up, almost all of them involving his failed attempts at relocating the tenant. The only other time the audience sees Jayakrishan in this persona is when he is shown farming in his land. There is, however, a particular scene in Thuvana Thambigal where the spectator briefly witnesses both personas of Jayakrishnan merge, that of the traditional landlord and that of the modern urban youth. This is in the second half of the movie when Jayakrishnan is sitting in a bar in the town with his influential and reckless friends, sipping beer, and suddenly decides that he has had enough with the nuisance created by the tenant Ramanonni. He subsequently brings his drunk friends to his village, kidnaps Ramanonni and takes him atop a dam. Jayakrishnan and his friends threaten to kill Ramanonni if he does not vacate in the next few days. Terribly frightened by this, he agrees to vacate the premises. This is important for the only time in the film the city has entered the space of the village. Jayakrishnan and his friends, often being drunk and aggressive, and the tenant being frightened by it, is portrayed as equal parts horror and equal parts comical. In this sequence, one cannot comprehend where Jayakrishna's aggressive masculinity ends and where Jayakrishna's aggressive modernity begins. This is also connoting Jayakrishna's admission to the inadequacies of his agrarian masculinity in situations as such, urging him to channel the strangely menacing yet similarly oppressive intimidation tactics that he has mastered from the time he spent in the city space. We are essentially witnessing a symbiosis between two historically antithetical subject positions within the elite Nair community. Curiously enough, once the tenant is blackmailed and evicted, Jayakrishnan is never again shown in the film conducting himself like a landlord. At the risk of reading the film's narrative at face value, it has to be said that part of the charm of Jayakrishna's character and the way it is constructed in the movie pertains to this notion that beyond the two distinctly loud and brash personas that he puts up in the village and the town, there is yet another one which is of contemplativeness, vulnerability, and alienation. Many of the scenes often convey the unease that Jayakrishnan feels in both spaces, that of the village and the city. More importantly, this is where the film makes use of an aspect inherited from the art house productions of the 70s, which is subjective interiority. Meena T. Pillai defines subjective interiority in parallel cinema of the 70s as a keen fascination with psychological complexity and nuances of the human subject, a constant evocation of the existential dimensions of identity, which in formal techniques called for tight close-ups and shying away from the verbose. Part of the appeal of middle-brow cinema at the time was its attempts to bring such aesthetic techniques into a movie format catering to a relatively larger target audience. We see glimpses of this technique used in scenes where Jayakrishnan is left alone or when he exits his friend or family circle. One example is the scene in which Jayakrishnan is giving a surprise to his friend Rishi, played by Ashokan, who at the time has no idea about Jayakrishnan's influence in the city. Rishi only knows Jayakrishnan from the village and he thereby buys into the naive villager act that Jayakrishnan puts up in that space. Jayakrishnan gets Rishi drunk and takes him into a hotel room in the city where Theresia Joseph, Rishi's neighbor and a sex worker, is waiting for Rishi. Seeing Rishi's shocked expression, Jayakrishnan and Theresia burst into laughter, followed by Rishi joining in. Jayakrishnan laughs for a while with Theresia and Rishi, and then he slowly starts moving out of the hotel room and closes the door from outside, still laughing. Here the camera zooms into his face, whereby his laughter slowly fades away as a sense of unease and weariness comes to replace it. The brooding background score assists this transition. Jayakrishnan then enters the adjacent room and asks his close friend Tangal, a pimp, to take care of the situation, and then slowly walks away from the camera. Tangal comes out of the room and looks at him, slightly worried, as Jayakrishnan is seen walking away with the music continuing in the background. The only other person who is assigned subjective interiority in the film is Radha, one of the two women that Jayakrishnan falls in love with. Here it is important to look into how the film treats Radha and Clara differently, both narratively and visually. Radha is very much the idealized, educated yet traditional woman. She is someone that every other character in the film wants Jayakrishnan to marry. Their relationship is portrayed as one that is anchored in the idyllic village space that both of them occupy. Their relationship progresses in the backdrop of the famous Vadakkum Nadar Shiva temple in Thrissur, especially during song sequences, signifying the presence of tradition, culture, heritage, and societal approval in their relationship. Radha is thereby portrayed as a symbolic border guard for the Nair culture. As the film progresses, Radha's point of view starts getting aligned with that of Jayakrishna's narrative. Thereby the film starts delving into Radha's interiority. One of the examples being an instance where Radha overhears her brother and sister talk about her growing fascination with Jayakrishnan. And the camera zooms into her face and we find her contemplating her own fascination with someone she initially did not like. This is something that is completely denied to Clara and will be discussed in the following section. Clara in the film is portrayed as a wise yet mysterious character, part of Jayakrishnan's and, by extension, the viewer's fascination with Clara stems from her indecipherability. Jayakrishan is introduced to Clara as a rich timber merchant called Punnus by the pimp Tangal, who has tasked Jayakrishan to find out if Clara is to be trusted. She immediately sees through the act he's putting up. Clara senses the alienation and loneliness faced by Jayakrishan and makes him open up to her about himself in a way he never thought possible. He falls in love with her. It is necessary to read Clara with her specific religious, class and caste circumstances, factors which are woven into the very fabric of her characterization. Part of what makes Clara distinct in Thuvanathambil is that she is not coming from an upper caste Hindu background, but from a Christian community living towards the coastal area of Thrissur. Clara is tied inextricably to the city space, unlike Radha and Jayakrishan, who have existence in both the city and the village. It is to be noted that the only other sex worker in the film is also Christian, Thracia Joseph. Both Thracia and Clara are women who moved from different rural spaces to the city for their profession. There is a scene where Clara and Jayakrishan are shown lying beside each other on the seashore at night. Jayakrishan is inebriated, shirtless, and Clara is wearing a nightdress. Both of them are constantly being pushed around by the waves hitting them at the seashore. Here in this moment, Jayakrishan speaks to Clara in a Malayalam dialect devoid of any regional markers, which amplifies the feeling of Clara and Jayakrishan being absolutely alone and free in that space. He tells her that since he has lost his virginity to Clara, he is afraid that he will become a womanizer. Clara smiles and tells him playfully that he should go and meet Radha again. Jayakrishan explains to her that he had refrained from being physically intimate with any woman before, for he had felt that he was saving himself for someone and also that he did not want to be the cause of anyone losing their virginity premaritally. It is important to note here that Thuvanathambil attempts to bring Jayakrishan's obsession with his own virginity to portray his masculinity as pure intention. This was perhaps a necessary trope for Thuvanathambil, being a movie exploring themes of sexuality and desire, catering to a fairly conservative audience of Kerala in the 80s. Jayakrishan says to Clara, Clara has made me break another one of my rules. I did not want to be the beginning of any woman's path to ruin. I had promised myself that if I broke this rule, then that woman would be by my side till the end of my partner. Can I marry you? Contrary to the way this dialogue seems to be constructed, Jayakrishan's proposition does not come across as obligatory, incoherent, or caused by the state of drunkenness. He means it, and Clara senses this. The very moment that Jayakrishan asks Clara to marry him, a wave hits Clara and shakes her more than usual, but her eyes remain fixed on him. In this very brief moment, Clara is caught off guard. For the next few seconds, she stares at Jayakrishan, shocked by the question. Jayakrishan follows this by asking in a bit more drunken and disarming manner, "Do you have any objections?" To which Clara laughs and tells him that she has no objections, and she laughs and falls into his embrace, followed by a song sequence. The few seconds where Clara is surprised by Jayakrishan's question is the closest Thuvanathambil ever comes to giving the audience a glimpse of the introspective space within Clara, as not just a metaphor for Jayakrishan's desire, but as a reflection of her own subject position. K.P. Jayakumar argues that the mystification of Clara's character is in some ways a violence towards her, for it makes her unreal and without perceivable intentions and emotions. Even her desires are rendered indecipherable. Unlike Radha and Jayakrishan, neither the narrative nor the cinematic aspect of the movie is invested in looking into Clara's subjectivity. Clara is denied subjective interiority by the film and is mystified and othered to an extent of almost seeming fantastical. Clara's near mystical relationship with rain also amplifies this aspect. Clara's presence for the most part of the film is accompanied by rain, and Jayakrishan associates rain with Clara throughout the film. Not to mention her affinity to the ocean. The prospect of a future with Clara is pictured in the fantasy song sequence as one with infinite possibilities, where they are shown getting married in different ways, living different lives, all of it to the fullest, none of them real. Clara is also not interested in either Jayakrishan's agrarian masculinity or its modern cosmopolitan antithesis. She is never shown engaging with either of these. Radha, on the other hand, is portrayed as someone who is in awe of Jayakrishan's duality. Clara likes Jayakrishan, who is devoid of both aspects, whereas Radha is attracted to his ability to perform both. Radha is attracted to the mobility that modernity provides Jayakrishan's Nair masculinity, where he can move in and out of urban and rural spaces unquestioned and unimpeded, privileged enough to seize the best of both worlds. Clara, on the other hand, represents the unresolved conflict between these two spaces and two personas caused by the same modernity that facilitates said mobility. She understands Jayakrishnan's loneliness and alienation caused by having to play these roles in different spaces, for she is also a product of similar conditions. Jayakrishan is thereby fascinated by Clara's fleeting, impermanent mystique. The movie, however, ends with Clara deciding to part with Jayakrishan, marry one of her clients, going on to have a child. Jayakrishan and Radha are thereby united. In the years that follow, many Malayalam films take up the trope of duality to make the Nair protagonist seem more interesting and sophisticated. Malayalam commercial films of the late 90s and early 2000s made it a habit to assign the Nair protagonist two different personas in rural and urban spaces. This was done to portray the Nair protagonist as someone who can not only function in, but also dominate both realms. A. Soman, in his essay The Return of Tamburans, discusses the prevalent presence of the Tamburan figure in the new commercial cinema of the 1990s. By the end of the 90s, the Nair protagonist is now the Tamburan of the village as well as the city. There was no more conflict between the two personas or the two spaces, not because it was resolved, but chiefly because the format of commercial cinema could not accommodate explorations as such. Thank you.
I want to thank all the speakers, Michiel, Ketaki, and Edu, for such interesting papers, and we will now take questions.
Hi, Michiel. There are few, if not few, 2-3 questions for you. One is that when you using the word new middle class, what exactly do you mean? I'm not very clear that are you using it in the sense like say somebody like Lina Fernandez will be using as a particular category which is also embodied practices and a certain kind of a political practice. That's the one question I'm not very clear. I was not sure, so if you could clarify that. Second thing is that regarding muscular India, like as the Joseph Walter's work also shows, muscular India is a very complex reality in the sense of it kind of cuts across the question of nationality, nation, virility, and then also the question of body, asceticism. That is one sort of axis. On the other hand, there is another axis that is coming up and which is also there in your ethnographies as well, is a sort of aspiration, then also a strategy of blocking those aspirations, which is also part of new middle class politics, and the other end, the global aspiration part of it. So I was just wondering, like, the problem with talking about new middle class aspiration, if you are using it in the sense of, say, Lila Fernandez, the caste is a very important component of it. Like the idea of a caste and mobility are very important there. So I was just wondering, how do you look at these intersections of global, national, and the muscular body? You know, given the fact that India has a long tradition of muscular, the idea of a muscular, the akhadas and so on and so forth. So how do you pose today's this global axis and aspiration and your gene and akhadas and the very nationalist discourse? Like how do you pose that? For Ketaki, what do you mean by desire here? I'm not very clear about. Like in the sense is that are we using desire in terms of a certain kind of a yearning, a certain kind of a things that we didn't have in terms of loss, or you? So how basically you sort of posing the concept of desire and tomboy? You know, like not are you? Is it? Cannot be just simply about aspiration, right? Or the something that I want, something I didn't have, something of a lack. It could be one because we are talking about failure on the one hand. But I'm interested to know, like, how do you position desire as a concept and the idea of a tomboy? You know, like, is there something specific to desire, a tomboyish desire? You know, is there something specific, or is just a question of moments of failure that constitute, the tomboy?
Okay, one question for Michiel and for Ketaki. Michiel, my question was that you emphasized on Bollywood and middle class aspirations, but specifically with regard to the gym and being with also regard to muscular India is also like does sports not play a role, because like sportsmen specifically also have a very different kind of image specifically among middle class men. I don't know like which specific sports to ask, like maybe cricket, or like did they also have idols, and did aspirations also model on those grounds? Because and did that come with certain amount of respect? Because sports is a very different kind of category in terms for the middle class. And Ketaki, my question for you is, did your participants, respondents, or have you also come across the importance or significance of hair in tomboys? Because often tomboys are identified with short hair, like irrespective of whether they themselves want to categorize themselves as tomboys, but just a woman with short hair is like categorized as a tomboy. So did you deal with this question? Like, did participants talk about this? Because often a woman, if she has longer hair, she's even if she does feel like a tomboy, but she would be categorized like those as like a proper model of femininity, essentially, because she looks like a woman. So in that sense of appearance, did it come?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, these are so obviously kind of sort of very broad questions that I deal with in the book, but wasn't able to include all of it here in this talk. To start with, all these categories like upper middle class, lower middle class, new middle class, middle class, and so on. So one argument I make is that it's almost impossible to define them. If you look at the literature that has come out now, and I make sort of kind of a very long analysis of that in one of the chapters, is that you see that not only a lot of the literature revolves around the question of size. So when we talk about the middle class, everybody always obsesses over the size. But intriguingly, the size almost doesn't differ. So one of the big claims that is always made about the middle class is that the middle class has grown exponentially because of economic growth. But if you look at the earliest literature on the middle class, it sort of came out post-1991, towards the new millennium, already speaks of 300 million, and that number remains rather stable as a high end. And from there you can also see that a lot of the categorizations is inherently problematic. What is new? One of the things that I make an analysis of is how, in fact, middle class categories in India have always been labeled new. The moment Lord Macaulay starts introducing the notion of we need to have a middle class people here can translate our wishes to blah blah blah, you see that every new middle class is always welcomed with not particularly open arms because they are the new middle class. So one thing that I propose in one of the chapters is that these categories mainly work as social and cultural constructs. And so they help us think through hierarchies, but they're not set in stone. They are inherently problematic. And the new middle class category, particularly so because it's generally evoked in a negative way from the perspective of the older middle class, who in many ways can be considered the upper middle class, because they are the ones that hold all the social and cultural capital. So yeah, the title Muscular, actually, I've given that a lot of thought because I realized on one of the laptops there is Ram Kanan, the documentary, and obviously it evokes suggestions that that happened in Mumbai in particular in the 1990s, where political parties made use of bodybuilders to underline that Hindutva could be muscular, Hinduism could be muscular. Of course, that debate goes back into colonialism. At the same time, there is a certain masculinity and muscularity that comes with this idea of a new India and how that's sort of made its way onto the global stage. So I think of it as a provocative title that I hope people will think critically about what that precisely is, because a lot of aspects of the books are precisely about these constraints, about these boundaries, which turn out to be incredibly sturdy. Like, it's really not that easy to climb up the middle class ladder. We always think like, you must be able to do that, right? But then and some of these people I've known for about a decade, so I've seen that from up close, how hard that can be, but also often how disappointing that can be, because you've never quite arrived. I often evoke the example of one of the first characters who is in the book, and when I first met him in Mumbai about a decade ago, I think he made about 15,000 per month. He now makes a lakh 0.5, so he's doing really well as a trainer. But the money is always gone because by now he's also moved up the middle class ladder. So his kid goes to a private school and he can no longer walk around in bazaar clothing, that fake brands, because the clients would immediately see that. So, there is also this kind of cumulative thing that middle class lives cost money. When it comes to aspiration and caste, I do talk about caste elsewhere, in particular as categories of upcoming intermediate caste groups such as the Gujars and the Jats in the NCR region, and how they are reflected on negatively as newcomers into middle class ranks. Because the research was conducted across India, so there are chapters that focus on Bangalore as well, on Chennai, Mumbai and Delhi. Obviously there's huge caste variety, so I partly conflate it with class categories because they work better in the gym. They are more prevalent, and people speak about them themselves. So one thing I didn't really come across in gyms is kind of sort of caste issue, but you can compare that almost with, for instance, how that works in the IT industry, where this was also never really a problem because there's simply no Dalits working, and it's increased. But when I did that research in 2003, it was a very Brahmin, upper caste, twice-born dominated field. So it was also quite easy to say that caste was not an issue on the work floor because, in that kind of context, indeed, it isn't really. In gyms goes as well, but I must say it's not a big aspect in the research, and I kind of expect this question to come up a lot more often. I think the interesting thing with caste also, when you think about middle class categories and class categories, is even though there have been years of different attempts to alleviate people out of poverty, against caste discrimination, etc. There is a time lag involved in that as well, right? Where the upper middle classes continue to profit from the social and cultural capital that you get from birth. As for the global, the national, now I'm going to talk way too long, so you need to shut me up if you think like, this has gone really boring. I feel like leaving now. Obviously, when it comes to different expectations of the body, part of this is a very globalized ideal, but it needs to exist at a local level. Maybe some of the follow-up questions can talk about that. And I think, let me just say one thing about sports and akharas, because that is something that often comes up. One, in the field of fitness, notions of cricket don't matter because they don't come with these kind of hegemonic, popularized new bodily ideals. So in that sense, that is something that is not aspired towards within the gym. That doesn't make cricket not important, of course, and cricket remains an important thing that people have a fascination for, but it's not necessarily something that comes with that kind of Bollywood glamour. Sports more in general, similarly, bodybuilding really exists outside of traditional sports through its organizations and the way it's organized. As for the akharas, there is some evidence that some of the workout routines historically have been adopted from the akharas into the gym. One trend that I've observed, especially in North India, is that the akharas are really on a demise because young people rather go to the gym, which tends to be air-conditioned. You don't have to do a lot of stuff in mud, and it leads to a bodily ideal that is currently more popular.
That's actually a very interesting question, and I've never thought about desire in that way, because I'm primarily, which is good, because then I should specify that, because when I'm talking about desire, I'm specifically only speaking about romantic and sexual desire. I'm not talking about the desire to be a tomboy. It's more, very often it's the failure of being at or being identified as, but not as not desire in that sense of the category, but in terms of romantic desire and sexual desire. And to come to your question of short hair, yes, I think all the participants do say that they have short hair, but it doesn't, somehow, it's a good question because I never asked about the question of hair, that did you ever have long hair and then were you, because that's a very interesting way of delineating femininities and masculinities, right? You just look at the hair and you assume that you fall in this binary or this side of the binary or that side. But I do remember speaking to someone generally about this paper, and they were saying that I mean, if a woman has short hair, she's looked at why are you like a boy and why are you disheveled. As in, it's also seen as somebody who's unkempt. Like she was Bengali, so she said "Chelen motun," why are you dirty in some sense, right? So it has those connotations. But thank you, because that's an interesting question to look at. That destabilizes the idea of, I mean, can you be a tomboy with long hair? That's a very interesting point to think with. Thank you. And just a comment and to Michiel. I was thinking, do these when they aspire to climb the class ladder, these bodybuilding, the trainers, do they think? I mean, they were thinking about the film industry and cinema and so on. Were they also thinking of modeling, or is modeling different from? Or is that the same thing as the fitness industry, or is that modeling? And I'm just thinking maybe that's not climbing the class hierarchy, but is there some? I mean, do they slip from that to become male sex workers, gigolos? Does that also come in? Because I mean, they are very often they double up as bodybuilders or male gigolos or masters, right? So, I mean, that would not be seen as climbing the ladder. But I mean, does that happen? Have you found that? And what is that relationship between being a model? So, if you want to be on the cover of Men's Health, are you a trainer, or are you a fitness person, or are you a model? As in, are these categories neatly defined, or are they fluid?
Yeah, well, this is actually a very interesting sort of side aspect of all of this, is that most people I met have some modeling ambitions, and usually, of course, that fails. It fails for kind of a variety of reasons. The most important thing is that male modeling, like female modeling, is highly specific. So a lot of men are either too muscular or not muscular enough, or because of the workout routines and use of substance such as anabolic steroids and otherwise are simply not suitable. It has a lot of health consequences, but the most visible are usually of the skin variety. Another issue with male modeling compared to female modeling is that there's virtually no money in it. So you need to think of that. It's one of the few fields actually where women are paid far more money than men. You need to think of it as almost tenfold. So you know, if a female model would get a leg for a photo, a male model would get maybe 10,000. Part of that also has to do is that the face matters a lot less. And bodies can be interchangeable and edited, so male modeling, if you look closely, is usually utilized in a very different way in magazine. It's much less focused on the face and much more on the body. So these are just sort of more technical aspects. Another thing that I've looked at and written about is, you know, usually these modeling ambitions lead to extreme disappointments, because the moment they meet with casting directors, it very quickly turns to sex. So this is constant, extremely prevalent. There's lots of professional photographers that I know that really combine this also by not charging, but rendering that as services, making use of that in terms of exchange. And of course that leads to questions of sex work. So I do have a chapter about this and how this leads to incredible fascination generally. So I try to unpack that fascination a little bit as well, so almost as an urban myth, that all these men must also be sex workers, because so much of what they do on social media is so often sexually explicit and often very clearly also homoerotically explicit, but that comes with very, very specific class layering as well. So whereas my informants might not always interpret it that way, my gay friends in Delhi definitely will. So there is kind of also where different impressions and expectations don't always match. But there is one person that I discussed in length, and I just met him again, re-interviewed him again, and he does work as a sex worker, and he does do pornographic work now as well. And obviously that is not a smart choice in terms of being upwardly mobile. Almost nowhere on the planet will that be received as a wise career decision. So there also play other questions in terms of monetary and precariousness, and how sometimes having the right body and the right face can mean a route out of poverty, but definitely not a route out of kind of this social and cultural stagnation in which people are trapped. So this is a person from a semi-rural background in near Chennai who, through basically modeling ambitions, gradually becomes a sexual trajectory shows, and of course he knows other guys who do the same. But one thing that I always find fascinating about that is the moment I try to, and then I become almost like an investigative journalist trying to understand how the dynamics that contribute to that, is that even then, where he himself works that way and works with other people, knows very few people who go as far as he has in that. So this myth-making thing and the way people sort of fantasize about who these men are, a very crucial aspect in understanding the place they take up in society. I wanted to ask a question to you. So I'm obviously not familiar with the filmmaker, but a little bit with what you call middle cinema. I think one thing that kind of struck me is because compared to, we talked about this earlier, compared to North Indian movies, Bollywood in particular, South Indian movies tend to be more socially conscious and often more situated in real life situations. So the legacy of these filmmakers, is that still around in modern day Malayali movie making, or has that now, is that under trend from kind of sort of this blockbuster drive that you see in Tollywood movies as well, where it's gradually become about the kind of Prabhas Bahubali movie model that kind of comes closer to Collywood, Bollywood, or is it still around?
Every time there is a change or a shift in Malayalam cinema from formulaic commercial cinema to something else. These directors in the 80s, their name is always invocated, as in is this the second coming of middle brow cinema or something like that. For example, in 2011, in 2011 something really interesting started to happen in Malayalam cinema, where a series of directors debuted, and from largely star-focused Malayalam cinema started to move towards more multi-star, much more there are a couple of reasons which influenced this. One is very interestingly that there was demand for a much more international sort of a movie because of torrents and everything, and a lot of people were experimenting with digitalization really helped also. And in 2011, Malayalam cinema had a couple of non-conventional hits actually, and every time that happened, from then Malayalam cinema has only moved forward in these experiments and everything. And there has been failures and there has been successes, but for the most part, towards the first couple of years, it was always this particular middle brow cinema and the directors that actually were the spearheads of this and everything. Their names were invocated a lot. This is often in hagiographic accounts of these directors, this particular time period is actually considered as golden era. It's only recently that this time period has been looked in more critical lens, through a more critical lens, and that this was not necessarily a golden era for all as in things were. So that sort of a thing is always there. But having a lower budget than other film industries, Malayalam cinema definitely has an advantage of experimenting a lot with and doesn't have to stick with a set formula and everything. But the other problem is also that there is this whole idea of exceptionalism, as in for the longest time, other movie industries were actually their commercial cinema was actually compared to the middle brow cinema as if this is the commercial, but it's a category mistake. As in Malayalam cinema has always had this exceptionalism, the our middle cinema is at the same time in the 80s when these movies were releasing, they were also commercial movies. But it's just this category is actually it comes into it comes to the forefront every time a new experiment or like a new movement starts. I think these directors and where this movement is actually located.
Yeah, hi, Ketaki. I have a question. So, considering that tomboy itself is very problematic to use, what exactly do you mean by good or bad? Can you clarify on that?
Yeah, so tomboy is actually the term which, and when I'm speaking about good and bad tomboy, and I also want to know why it's problematic to use. I'm asking that to you. You can answer that later. But the question of the good and tomboy is something that Judith Halberstam discusses, and she's saying is the good tomboys, which is seen socially as the good tomboy, that you are, and as an adolescent you are a tomboy, but when you grow up you don't remain, so you become a feminine woman. So she's saying that socially that's seen as a good tomboy, but the bad tomboy is where you don't become a feminine woman, where you continue to be queer, right? So she's saying that. So that is the distinction that she's making between good tomboy and bad tomboy, Judith Halberstam. And I'm saying she because at that point of time when she was writing the book, her name was Judith, not Jack. So what I'm doing here is trying to say that, look, these categories don't really work. There is nothing like a good or bad tomboy. But I also want to know, why do you think that tomboy as a term is problematic to use?
Because nowadays it's seen as that I'm not like other girls kind of phenomenon,
Okay.
where girls just try to act as if, like, there's this internalized misogyny within them as well, where they try to kind of invalidate women who just want to also be feminine, or basically there's just a lot of like, they try to be this other without anyone actually prompting them to be another, and that, I agree with you, that's very socially influenced. So yeah. Okay, thank you so much for clarifying.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, but so you're trying to say the tomboy is problematic only in cases where it might be, but there's an aspiration to be like the boys. But that's what I'm saying. It's not just that. It's a category which includes a number of kinds of tomboys, to so to speak. But I get where you're coming from, like what you're problematizing. Thank you.
But maybe because I'm also interested in what you were trying to say with that, and I've gotten used actually to all these kind of sort of gender categories to gradually lose steam, no longer being fashionable, change, people interpret them differently. I think that's also actually in many ways the wonderful thing about sexuality is that it's never set in stone. So one thing that actually just occurred to me is the tomboy category gradually, I wouldn't say replaced, but maybe something that I've noticed myself become more prevalent among students and writing is the NB category. So NB or non-binary. So, and how does that figure into things? Because I see a lot of non-binary categories on TV these days, and just yesterday I was watching the third season on Netflix of Sabrina, which is this, it's really a fun show. And so there's a very, very prominent non-binary category character in that TV show. Whereas that storyline itself is interestingly not problematized constantly, which in the past this would have been constantly in your face, like you had to be reminded of how horrible this person's life is. And I think one of the nicer things about kind of sort of pop media is that it gradually tries to move beyond that, and then this simply becomes another person who's allowed to exist on their own terms. I think I should use the pronoun there. So I was kind of wondering if you could say something about that, if at all.
That's really interesting, and I don't think it might have gone out of fashion, maybe because, I mean, apart from these certain, maybe it's just, maybe, I don't know, that's a good point. I'll have to think about it. So there is one book which looks at the history, the literal cultural history of tomboy, but that's in the Western context. In the Indian context, I'll have to make it. I'll have to look at if that's used at all, and maybe within or maybe within certain circles, maybe within a certain age group, it's used as a slur, maybe it's used problematically, and that's very interesting, because that could, how does that also travel with with time and with place, and maybe that's not used at all anymore with the way I'm speaking about. So that's a very interesting thought. Yeah. Yeah, in that show Sabrina the Witch, is she called a tomboy? Is she like? It's just
very clearly a person that does not define. He in the show goes by the name of Theo, but Theo can work both ways, from Theodora. So it was definitely presented as a queer person in the first season, but I think probably a better word would be NB, or NB is itself for non-binary more and more a category that you see in. I'm currently writing a paper on the way the discussion about queer identities in India developed over the last 20 years, and in that, of course, you see that the length of words used gets longer as well. So, we start with LGBT, and then we add the Q, and then we add the I, and then the A, and then some people stop there with a plus sign. But not everybody wants that, so, because then people are not included. And so there's this constant development there, and I think that's fascinating to impact also when you speak on tomboys, even though I think it's still a popular category to be used, but yeah.
I think the term non-binary is more politically correct to use rather than tomboy or non-binary or gender non-conforming or gender queer. So in that sense, maybe that's where she covered, but it's a very interesting question to think about. Yeah.
No, I can project my voice, it's fine. Non-binary is not interchangeable though.
Probably want to use the mic.
No, the non-boundaries are probably not interchangeable, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. With regard to Tom, yeah.
Yeah.
Just to clarify that. No, before anybody thinks that I suggest that these things could replace all the category, I'm merely suggesting that there is always some kind of sort of fluid motion where new categories come up that people identify with and feel comfortable with. That doesn't mean that the old category no longer functions to exist. It's more that sexuality in that sense in itself is a dynamic thing. So it is not fixed to any of these categories. I think that's in my own writing why I often use queer, because it kind of brings together that non-normativity without deciding what categories should or should not be included, because that is such a political process and it's so demeaning in many ways because of obvious reasons, yeah.
This question is actually to all three of you. It's more than a question. I would like to know about your opinions regarding sexuality of people or children with disabilities. So right now I am pursuing research on this topic of sexuality of children with disabilities. So I would like to know what your opinions are on it, or have you ever considered it in your research?
That's an interesting question, because when I was doing my PhD on sexuality education, we in some sense, I did not, of course, I was looking only at the sexuality of able-bodied adolescents. But in looking at the formation of the curriculum, there was beginning to be the question of, can we look at the intersection of disability and sexuality? But that was in the context of adults. But it was coming into, in some sense, to the discussion of adolescents or young people or children and sexuality and disability. So for instance, I think somebody made was it a book or a guide for somebody visually impaired to understand what, let's say, the female genitalia or the reproductive system looks like. So it was, and there are certain ways to address that, but I feel that that's a very upcoming field in the sense that we haven't really looked at that triple intersection of age, sexuality and disability. Because when we talk about disability and sexuality, we never really talk about age. So that's interesting when we talk about adolescents or children. And then again, how do you look at that age? Do you look at it developmentally? Where do you stop being a child? When do you stop being an adolescent? When do you start being an adult? Legally you are just a child until you are 18, right? And adolescence, the term itself is a fairly new development. So not to go into more details on that, but I mean, I don't really have an opinion because I haven't done any work, but I'm just telling you what I came across while doing this research.
Yeah, I'm also far from an expert on any of this. I do think that some of the questions, especially when it comes to sexuality and children or adolescents, at least in a Western context, have been set back by a few decades because of all the scandals surrounding it. So that has definitely made it a lot more difficult to talk about it. I come from the University of Amsterdam, and it's probably one of the most liberal on those topics, and I've seen that when a colleague tried to engage in these topics a few years ago, and that led to an incredible amount of commotion. So yeah, like I said, it's not a topic that I know all that much about. One thing, a subfield in disability studies that I find interesting is the role of online media and virtual technologies. That is one emerging field that you might be interested in, for also the conceptualization and theorization about how people kind of break through the boundaries of their own disabilities, so the limitations and how they kind of sort of negotiate their way around that. But that's merely if you were my student and you would come to me with that question, I would say, well, you know, you might want to look into that because there's some interesting work being done there, but you'll have to forgive me that otherwise I wouldn't really know what useful things to say about this.
No, as in, this is also something that I also need to look into. I've only come across this in articles and everything, so I also need to look into this.
So I mean, if you want to do research on looking at and childhood, the first question will come is question of ethics, right? So I mean, forget even disability. So you know, there are a number of hurdles in terms of doing research. So one is, are you doing research? Are you doing some intervention program? Specifically doing research, if even with anyone below the age of 18, the ethical concerns are so large, especially when you're talking about sexuality, it's almost impossible to do that. Forget disabled children, right? So you're looking at intersections of intersections, right? So though that I would warn you. I mean, if you want to do, think about that very carefully.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Michiel, Ketaki, and Yadu once again for all the interesting talks, and thank you, audience, for listening to us, for listening to us patiently, for all the interesting questions. Thank you.